Fellow GMs, are you tired of burnout? I think this is a problem that every GM has experienced at one point or another, and I think I finally found the solution to the problem. Welcome to the Tabletop Empire. My name is Nate, and today I'm going to be sharing my secret for how I avoid GM burnout. This stems from the most helpful advice I've ever received as GM, and it does not only just apply for Star Wars RPG, but for D&D and every other tabletop RPG as well. And this isn't just 10 tips and tricks. This is an actual shift in the mindset of how you view the GM and their role at the table. So let's start with the question: why do GMs burn out? We will expand upon this throughout the video, but it all boils down to the table's mindset and expectations for what the GM should be and for what the GM should do for the game. And this also includes GMs, your own view of your role. So it boils down to the table as a whole's mindset. And that mindset is that the GM is not a player, but a completely separate entity at the table. And this mindset comes with expectations and burdens on the GM that ultimately lead to burnout. So if burnout is the problem that we're trying to fix and the mindset is the problem, what's the solution? That the GM is a player too. The only real difference between the GM and the player characters is that the GM role plays in a slightly different way. While the players are role playing their own individual characters, the GM is just role playing everything else. So let's take a look at what it means when we say that the GM is a player at the table and really break down that statement, because it's the core foundation to everything. It may not sound revolutionary, but it will completely change the way that we GM. And if we explore and we go down this rabbit hole, you will see that it comes with a couple key shifts in the way that we think and view and see the role of the GM at the table. So there's really three key shifts, and the first one is that the GM is not responsible for the story. The GM is not responsible for the adventure. You are not responsible for it, GMs. It's not on your shoulders. It is the player who is responsible. You, the GM, are a player. You PCs are players. You are all collectively responsible for the story and the adventure. And now GMs, instead of you carrying that burden by yourself, you now share it with the table. So you might be wondering, how can I share responsibility for the story? Well, I'm glad you asked. So first start with just sitting down with the other players and explaining to them that you're trying this new way to GM, this is what you expect from them. And just let them know that you're trying a new and better way to GM, and it might take a couple sessions to get the hang of it. Let them know that the expectation is now that they need to be able to make decisions and build the story with those decisions. We as GMs are there to provide the context, to roleplay the NPCs, and to give the PCs a little bit of a nudge whenever they get stuck or don't know what to do. But they should almost always know what to do, and the reason is, every player should have a goal, something to work towards, a clear vision for where they want to take their character, to have an objective that drives their character forwards. If they don't have goals yet, then sit down with them and help them realize what their character's goals are. Every player needs a goal, whether that be a big goal or a small goal, it really doesn't matter. In Star Wars RPG, they can use their motivations that they picked during character creation to help them decide what the goals should be. And you GMs, you should also know the goals of the characters and NPCs that you are role-playing. And not only that, you should know your own goals for the story and what you would like to contribute. And then there's a little bit of a side tangent that could really be its own video, but I'm going to boil it down to one sentence here, is that a world filled with NPCs that all have their own goals will be much more interesting and immersive than a world where the NPCs' motivations stop at interacting with the character. The third way that you can share the story's responsibility is that GMs, you will need to let go of the be characters in my story mentality. This is not your story, it's not your novel, it's not your movie. It is a collaborated adventure. It's everybody working together. It may be hard to let go of this mentality, either because you love control or you're maybe stressed out about the idea of not having control. But the moments in your game that are not a part of the plan are typically the best moments in your game. If you give your players the space to make decisions that can change or alter the story, you'll find more moments of laughter, amazing dialogue, gripping story, and best of all, players that are not only just present, but they're actively engaged in the game. Because when their decisions and their choices matter to the story, they will be more invested in the story. So instead of spending 8+ hours planning out every little detail of each session and the entire campaign from start to finish, plan where the story could go and ideas that you want to implement into the story. And then most of the time, if you want some big key dramatic moment or story thing to happen, you can still insert that into whatever the players are doing. And you can weave it into the story that they've created and that you've created and built together. Because remember, this is your story too. You can input your own things into the story still. This is not only the players and it's not only you, it's collaborated. But this kind of leads into our second key shift, in that the GM should not be spending spending hours upon hours planning every single session. The GM should be spending about as much time as the players do in out-of-game work in relation to the game. So while the players are spending their time figuring out their new abilities, spending XP, figuring out maybe their motivations or their goals or obligations changed, while they figure out that stuff, you are doing the prep work minimal prep work for the next session. But you may be wondering, Nate, how do I reduce the amount of time that I spend prepping sessions? I will say that the method that I used requires a little bit more front-end work, but once you have it set up, it really doesn't take that much time to plan future sessions. So I get a package of index cards and I write down 10 NPCs as well as 10 different encounters, and for each of the 10 NPCs, I write down their characteristics, their skills, maybe whatever gear they have, and a little bit about their character and their motivations, but I leave enough of it vague so that way they can be inserted into wherever the story needs them. I make sure that these NPCs are also varied so that way I have the kind of NPC that I need when I need it. So when you're in session, you can pull these NPCs and you can pull these encounters as they are needed and as they fit into the story. If you're playing Star Wars RPG for enemies, I actually recommend using this website, swa.stugoff.com. I found it recently and it has been a major help. They have a long list of enemies, adversaries, and canon characters available, each one with stats and skills and abilities ready to use. You have a group of enemies, well, it's no worries because you can just click this little plus sign above the skills table to add the number of minions in the group, which automatically updates the skills dice roll as well as the wound counter, which you can also track the minions' wounds. And you can have tabs at the bottom if you have multiple enemy types or hero NPCs helping the party. The site is a real lifesaver, and I'm not aware of anything like this for D&D, but there are a lot of companion websites that make fighting enemies easier, whereas before finding this website for Star Wars RPG, I personally had to browse either the wiki or go through a bunch of different books to try to find enemies. So earlier I mentioned coming up with ideas for where the story could go, and so what I do is I turn those into bullet points. I typically have 6 or so bullet points for where the story could lead, but this can vary depending on however long the session's gonna be and the GM's preference. These can be potential places for where the story leads, they could be specific story beats, forks in the story. This method is really flexible and is really only there as a fallback that you can use if the story starts to stall or the PCs get stuck and don't know what to do. For me personally, I typically have about 3 bullet points for the first half of the session and then 3 bullet points for the last half of the session, and my sessions last about 4 hours long. Sometimes I don't use them at all, sometimes I use most of them. It really just depends on the game. But having this really minimal, bare bones planning really forces my improv and has improved my ability as a GM. But like I said, it's a little bit hard to get used to at first, and if your players know that you're trying this new thing and it may take a couple sessions to get used to, they should be pretty understanding. And having this space, this open space, allows your players to be able to make decisions and still impact the story. But ultimately, improv requires you to have your world figured out beforehand. For Star Wars, this is easier because we have movies and shows and books and video games and a plethora of things to build ideas off of. But even then, whether you're in Star Wars or not, you need to reflect about, okay, where are my players? Where are the different possibilities that they can go? And really just kind of building out the map and the world in your head. And you don't have the right stuff down, though if that works for you, great. But you can figure this stuff out maybe while you're at the store, while you're on a walk, while you're at work, maybe you're between matches of Call of Duty or another video game. But just taking the time to understand the area your players are in, visualizing what it looks like. What are the people like? Do they like the Empire? Do they not like the Empire? Are they pretty closed off to outsiders? Are they welcoming of outsiders? Are there any dark secrets within the culture? If you're consuming a book or a movie or a game, whether it's Star Wars or not, no matter what system you're in, you can still draw inspiration from that media. You'll find that thinking about your world, really taking the time to think and figure it out, will really help a lot when your players decide to go down that side path that you never intended to be there. So between refilling your NPC and encounter cards and writing down your couple of bullet points, you shouldn't really be spending more than about an hour prepping each session. No more late nights and no more stress because you procrastinated planning this until the morning of the session. No more 8 hours of planning a session just for the players to derail it and ruin all 8 hours of your hard work. If you like battle maps, I find that a whiteboard and some colored markers work really well for coming up with impromptu things on the spot and then using your narration to fill in the gaps of what everything looks like. It's my preferred method as it's a lot quicker and less time consuming than designing a full-on battle map, and it's less muddled than pure theater of the mind combat is, so it's that like nice happy middle ground. For virtual groups, I mean Microsoft Paint, but I'm sure there's better virtual stuff online to use. It doesn't have to be pretty, it just has to work, and then you can use your descriptions to fill in the gaps. Okay, so we have one more key shift, and then I'm going to tie all of this together. But first, if this is helpful so far, please do me a favor and blast that like button. It really helps out the channel, and it helps more GMs hear this advice. If you enjoy the content I make and you want to see more of it, consider subscribing. So the third and final key shift. The GM should not be the only one who knows the rules. Sure, an argument can be made that the GM should know the rules the best since they're the one running the game, and a lot of final decisions on what's a legal or illegal move or action comes down to the GM's ruling. But the players should also have a pretty good understanding of how the game works. And I'm going to get into why, but first I want to let you GMs know if you're new to this system, or any system, whatever you're playing, you do not need to know all of the rules to start playing, and you don't need to know the entire rulebook in order to be a GM. If you feel obligated or stressed because of you feel like you need to know the rules, please let me alleviate that. While it's true that GMs need to have a general understanding of the rules, you don't have to be a rule encyclopedia and know everything. If a point in your session comes up and you don't know the rules, you just follow these 3 easy steps. Decide, continue, review. Decide the rule. If everybody at the table is confused about the rules and they don't know what the rulebook says, then in the moment, right there, decide the rule. As the GM, just decide what the rule is in that moment. It doesn't matter what the rulebook says. Do not pause the game for 20 minutes to open up the rulebook and try to figure it out. Instead, decide on the rule and continue the game. Keep it moving. After the session, you can go back and review and then implement whatever you learned for future sessions. If you screwed over one of your players with your ruling that was wrong, it's fine, just talk to them and see if there's a small way you can make it up to them. A house rule that I have is for Star Wars RPG, if I mess up on a ruling and it hurts the players, the next session I give them 1 extra destiny point at the start of the game. Every GM makes mistakes. You will make mistakes. It is nothing to be worried or stressed about, it just happens. That being said, the players also need a good understanding of the game, because the GM is not perfect, and the GM is not an encyclopedia, and it's not the GM's job to be the complete all-knowing knowledge of the rules at the table. And this should be another burden lifted off the GM's shoulders. For people who play Star Wars RPG, if only there was a series on YouTube that went through the entire core rulebook showing how to play the game. I really wish something like that existed, because then the players would have no excuse to not know the rules. It would be really convenient if there was a link to that in the description. And I think that this third key shift, that the GM should not be the only one who knows the rules, really kind of boils down into a deeper problem, is that the GM should not force the player characters to care. If you have to do any of these things with your group at home, it may be time to try to find a new group. No GM should have to beg their players to pick up the rulebook or at least watch a few videos to understand how it works. And assuming the campaign isn't on a consistent schedule yet, the GM should not be the only one reaching out, trying to figure out who can play, what date can we finally meet up, which is honestly only made worse when the players have to be hounded for a response. And my personal pet peeve is that the GM should not have to ask the players to pay attention or repeat themselves over and over again, especially if the player was just on their phone or not paying attention. Your time is valuable, so try to play with a group that respects each other's time. I understand that players can be hard to come by, so if this is a problem for you and your group and you can't find more players, then I recommend trying to sit down and talk with them and let them know that this is what you need from them if they want to continue to play. And when you apply everything here that we've talked about, you'll realize that the GM should not be burning out anymore. The GM should be having fun. Bringing back up the question from before, why do GMs burn out? But this time we're going to add a little bit of a twist to it. Why is it that the GM is the only one burning out at the table? You never really see player burnout. It is always and only the GM. Why is that? I feel that the reason that GM burnout happens is because it's just too much work to try to carry the responsibility by yourself for the players, the game knowledge, the story, and making sure that you actually even get together to play at all, and coordinating all of that yourself. I feel like GM burnout happens is because on top of having to wrangle all the players together, you're spending 8+ hours into the night planning for every single session. Meanwhile, your players are off doing what they want to do with friends, with video games, or sleeping, and they have absolutely no worries besides just just showing up and playing the game. Then when the session finally does happen, maybe the GM expectations are not met because you just spent 8 hours planning a story that the players completely derailed. So all that time spent planning wasn't worth it. And now instead of having fun playing a game, it just feels like work that you have to do, which no longer makes it a leisure activity to take, stress off of your life. It becomes something adding stress to your life. And sure, maybe the game keeps going for a few sessions, but eventually the burnout will settle in, and eventually the campaign just fizzles out and dies because you keep procrastinating planning the session because you don't want to anymore, and you stop reaching out to your players to see if they even actually care and say something, but they don't. I mean, I could be alone in this, but am I the only one who's experienced this? This is a game. It's a fun experience. It's supposed to not be this stressful. So why are we as GMs making this harder on ourselves? Instead, I propose that we as GMs apply this new mindset to our games. Throw away the burden of responsibility of carrying the entire weight of the game single-handedly, and instead just start playing the game. You will find a new and refreshing feeling when it comes to being a game master. So GMs, remember, you are a player too. I hope you found this video helpful. I will be in the comments to answer any questions you might have. Again, if you found this video helpful, please do me a favor and blast that like button so more people can see this advice. And if you want to see more of our content, I upload every week, so hit subscribe. A huge thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. We just launched last week, so your support really means a lot and helps this channel continue to grow. If you are interested in providing funding for future videos or for the channel, check the link down in the description for Patreon. Thank you so much again for watching the video. I will see you guys in the next one, but until then, and as always, may the Force be with you.